Okay, well, thank you very much. So I'm not going to be necessarily focusing on what's delivered on the ground, but more the planning policies. And I've posed a question that this presentation is going to answer. So what does a good green infrastructure policy look like? What I intend to do very quickly is skirt through this issue about what is green infrastructure, because that's a term that isn't universally understood and applied. Then to focus on what makes a good GI policy. And then the crux of the talk really is trying to assess how well national policies at the moment, particularly the National Planning Policy Framework in England, 2018 revised, and the Planning Policy Wales, again 2018 in December revised, how well they are addressing green infrastructure. So what is green infrastructure? I'm going to turn to the EU for the definition because I believe that provides perhaps the most comprehensive one. No other reason. So the key elements in bold really sum it up, that it's a strategically planned network which covers multiple scales. It's designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services and the multiple benefits from those. And it is green and blue, which quite often can be neglected in a term called green infrastructure. Blue gets implicitly hidden. It also is a benefit to the economy, to people, and to biodiversity. So it recognises those multiple dimensions that James talks about, that is its greatest strength, but equally can be its weakness. So my focus really on planning policies is important because they are often neglected. There are very few assessments of planning policies. Now we have in the UK a plan-led system, which means that the development plan is the principal tool for making decisions, unless material considerations dictate otherwise. So the National Planning Policy Framework and Planning Policy Wales, which are the national guidance, they provide the framework, some people call it guidance, some people call it dictate, by which these development plans are designed and actually operated. And as well as that, they are material considerations themselves in planning decisions. So I make no excuses for focusing on what might be seen as a rather sort of boring element of planning, which is those local and development plans. They don't seem to attract much attention at consultation stage in the same way that a planning application does, but boy do they have power, and that's one of the key issues about how good the policies are. And this is recognised by the Natural Capital Committee back in 2015, where it talks about the importance of building GI into these development plans. We need good policies. But as the Natural Environment White Paper back in 2011 talked about, we currently have disintegrated policy. This was recognised that the current system is failing to deliver. And in fact, with the recent Rainsford review of planning conducted by the Town and Country Planning Association, that merely confirmed the policy disintegration that we have within the planning system. And one of the main reasons for that is that we do love our silos. So we tend to have this focus on particular aspects of specialisation, and very few people actually walk the tightrope that tries to link those different policy silos together. We need to release that poor chap tied to his chair. So what does good GI policy look like? And this is a useful metaphor because you can build the most elaborate castle you like, which is the metaphor for the policy. But if it's not built on a solid base and the tide's coming in, your policy is going to get washed away. So that is a metaphor that maybe reflects the rest of the talk. The first thing is, what does a good policy look like? Well, I would go to, what does it look like on the ground? And the examples here, two examples of good urban green infrastructure, which are part of a living grey, green and blue network, and maybe instead of grey I'll use the word silver. They show maybe aspirations of what we're trying to deliver. The the slide on the right, or the diagram on the right, reflects Newcastle's strategic green infrastructure map, which highlights, you'll see the sort of greeny, don't know what colour it would be, stone green, shows the existing green infrastructure network, and the areas of yellow surrounding it are the opportunity spaces. And that area of identifying where a strategic network exists and how it can be enhanced is key to delivering these kind of built developments. So what I did with a colleague in Glasgow, building on his experience in Scottish planning, was to say, is there a framework that we can deliver that actually helps local planning authorities and government assess the quality of their policy? And what we didn't do is start from scratch. We were building on existing research that already exists. So there are Natural Environment Research Council projects building with nature. There is an IGI project, part of the Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network study. And then there's my own work done as part of my NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellow role. So we put these together in a suit to create an A to Z matrix. These are the particular themes that we wanted to home in on. And these were really built on the functions of GI. Can I stress that? We're not trying to cater for every benefit of GI, but it's trying to address the functions. And you'll see that within the actual matrix itself. But as well as functions, we're also looking at mainstreaming, and we're also looking at stewardship, key areas that James alluded to at the beginning that are needed to be built in. So I know you can't see that. I'm going to drill into that in a bit more detail later on, but we created an A to Z of 26 assessment criteria. And these really are built from that preceding research that I was telling you about. These are the elements that capture the diversity and multifunctionality of green infrastructure. So I put in 5 examples here that hopefully you can read. And effectively, we've developed these with workshops with planners in the west of England. We've tested it with the Green Infrastructure Sounding Board of the Town and Country Planning Association. And we've also had consultation from my own website to actually create the final matrix. So how do you use it? Well, those planners we've been working with have been designing their new local plans. So the first thing is, you may not have a plan, you might be writing one, but if you want to use it retrospectively, you read a given plan or strategy. You look at the culture of that plan, the vision, and how GI is involved in it. You undertake word searches to identify areas of the plan that reflect those assessment criteria. And then you're scoring it. And you score it on the extent to which there is GI coverage. So for each assessment criteria, you're looking at how well that criteria is met. And you're also scoring it with the policy's strength of the wording. So you've got coverage. Does it actually cover the area? And secondly, how strong is the wording within that? And it's a very crude traffic light system. So here's some examples of strong and weak phrasing. Pretty obvious. Will, must reflect strong phrases. Perhaps should, consider, where appropriate, are weak. They're key to the planner acts, as I call ourselves, when we're looking at the strength of a policy wording, because that implies commitment for action. So taking example from Planning Policy Wales, this is one of their paragraphs that talks about SUDs, and I put in bold examples there that are key to the assessment that has been covered. I won't read it out, but you can see the key elements that are within that. Now, if you actually look on the bit at the bottom on the criteria M, N and 0, you'll see that in terms of coverage, I've scored that green. It fully covers because it is talking about explicit reference for green infrastructure. It's talking about multifunctionality and it's talking about naturalised design. So the coverage is there fully. If we look at the strength, the policy's strength, the wording, we're looking for the verbs there. It's should. And should is okay, but that can be trumped, especially if you're Donald. So there's always this issue of should, not as strong, it's not green, so it's amber. So that's where those elements are scored there. Here's another one from the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraphs 91 and 98 put together. And we're looking here at active and healthy travel. And you'll see what we've got here are two greys. So we don't get explicit reference to GI, we're getting some coverage, we're getting links about opportunities for active and healthy travel, and we're getting some reference to public access networks. So yeah, that gives you the kind of key scoring. And I'm going to switch now directly to the National Planning Policy Framework. So we took those principles, we identified the relevant sections of the National Planning Policy Framework and scored them appropriately. You'll see at the bottom, this area here, is the highest scores. So what we've done is we've taken the highest scores along the rows, along the column, to create an overall score at the bottom. And if you look at the Planning Policy Wales, they're the two matrices side by side. That's not going to mean a lot to you because the whites, don't get worried about the whites. The whites are only problematic when this slide comes up. So what we've got here are areas where there is no coverage. If there's white now, that means those assessment criteria are not covered at all. So I could ask you which one's which. You might better guess. The top one's the MPPF and the second one's Planning Policy Wales. And what that highlights, there's some common issues, is that SUDS and particularly some of the stewardship issues are quite poorly covered. But you can see, let's turn to the MPPF as a whole. In England, you'll see that stewardship is completely absent. There is no policy recognition at all on stewardship and very little on SUDS. With Planning Policy Wales, there are elements of SUDS that aren't covered, but there is a big difference, I hope you can see visually in the summary scores. So I am a bit cheesy, so I've presented my evaluations in cheese. So for the English version, we've got kind of an Emmental cheese, which has got lots of holes in it for the coverage, and a Lancashire cheese for its crumbliness in terms of policy strength. Because if we go back, you'll see for the policy strength, there are no greens at all for the English. And in Wales, there is only one or two greens, which means that the wording, however good the coverage is, the wording is vulnerable to being trumped by other issues. So this is highlighting graphically the vulnerability. The second cheesy metaphor for Planning Policy Wales is, there's a lot of choices in Planning Policy Wales. 255 pages, lots of paragraphs. So it's sometimes quite difficult to pick out the bits that are actually relevant to you. It's a bit like the Bible, anybody can use it. It also has a crumbly cheese, but it has elements of strength in it. So that's why I went for Danish blue. So how do we get round? How do we use those national guidelines for local? So what we're trying to suggest is that local planners can start writing improved policy where they try and focus explicitly on improving that matrix scoring with better integration, better design-led policies, better multifunctionality. Also, to address the weaknesses in funding, to identify and use existing tools for maintenance and funding, such as SIL, to recognise the quality of life benefits of green infrastructure, particularly in active travel and recreation, to have much more focus on green belts, and more importantly, to use the current hooks on health, air pollution and climate change to infiltrate green infrastructure outcomes, because that's what people are interested in, and you insert that. We can also develop model policies based on best practice from elsewhere. So to draw to my final slide, I started off with what makes a good policy. There is no one good GI policy. This is the key message. You have to have multiple policies across to address the GI multifunctionality. You need to have policies that cut across the different chapters in plans and strategies. They mustn't be just focused in one chapter. And you also need critically to pay attention to policy wording, because presently it is not good enough, it is not strong enough, which could lead to trumping. And I think there is a key role for local plans to build on these weaknesses to create the right policy environment for investment in green infrastructure. Thank you.